Hi, welcome back to my channel. So for this video, I wanted to talk about my favorite podcasts. There are two types of people in this world, those who love podcasts, those who don't. I happen to have an immense love for them. I've been listening to them religiously every single day for I don't know how many years. I graduated high school. I graduated college in 2016 and I've been listening to them before that, so a long time, right? So today I wanted to talk about, I'm looking down because I have my notes here, right? So my five-ish favorite book podcasts. So like any other person, I align the things I listen to with my interests, which are mystery, history, horror, music, productivity, and literature. And more stuff too, but I just can't think of it right now. So, but I do have written down here my five-ish favorite book podcasts. So the first one is Bad Books for Bad People. Now, this is one of my favorite book podcasts. It's hosted by Tenebrous Kate and Jack Wignol. And they discuss what they call the dark and the spooky. And I'm going to read this directly from their website. The books discussed range from classics of Gothic literature to startling works of new weird, from romantic potboilers to horror epics, from cult favorites to obscure pulp treasures. I love that. And so if you already think that it's weird, that these books are gonna get weird, they definitely do. And I love it because the hosts are so just not afraid to explore all of that, which makes it even fun for me, like funner. So they don't hold back on their opinions at all, which is something that I really love because it takes away whatever uncomfortable feelings you might have about a book and you can actually discuss it, right? So some of my favorite books that have come from this podcast are The Monk by Matthew Lewis, Creatures of Wool and Temper by Molly Tanzer, and also, I have it written down here, Torture Garden by Octave Mirbeau. Okay, Torture Garden is so weird. Like amazingly weird. Read these books at your own discretion, okay? Podcast number 2 is Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, along with Witch Please podcast. So that's why I said at the beginning that these were going to be 5-ish bookish podcasts. Because I mix them, and then there's going to be an honorable mention podcast at the end. So these are two separate podcasts, like I said, but they both discuss the Harry Potter series as a whole. And because of that, I feel like they go together, but it's also because they have completely different takes on it. But they kind of merge together. I'm going to go over it, but I think that they go really well together if you listen to them back to back. So Witch Please is the first one that I ever listened to. And it's made up by Marcel Causeway and Hannah McGregor, who are two scholarly ladies, as they call themselves on the podcast. And they dive very deep into the books, the movies, the extra books that come along with it, and just like specific topics in the Harry Potter series, which I think just is so good. Because they can really focus in on the series, but also focus out of it to see how everything else that surrounds the books goes with the universe and like what people love about it, you know? So they're so clever with their language, they're so charming, and they are so academic with it too, but not in a pretentious way, in a way that actually makes you listen to what they're saying and understand their arguments. That is just, it's such a good podcast, and they make it seem effortless. Also, they make it seem effortless, and I'm shook every single time because they're not a self-imposed rule that they have is that they're not allowed to do research to add on to whatever they're thinking. They just have to read the books and discuss it. And that's when their academic background really shows, because they use such specific language and specific words. Like when you hear them talk, you know that there is nothing else that they could be except scholars, but not pretentious scholars. So that's the best part about it. They're amazing women. It's a great podcast. Definitely listen to it. And then Harry Potter and the Sacred Text is, I don't know if it's more well-known, but, well, it could be more well-known because I think it falls under Night Vale Productions, and Night Vale is a really well-known company and podcast. Oh, also, welcome to Night Vale. Not a bookish podcast, but it's a creative podcast, has to do somewhat with books. You know what? I'm adding it to it. Listen to Welcome to Night Vale. An amazing story. So good. So good. Okay, so Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. They discuss the books, and it's Vanessa Sultan and Casper ter Kuile, and they are theologists at Harvard Divinity School. And this podcast, even though it's scholarly and academic to a certain point, it's so... I think the only way I can describe this podcast is loving. Not to say that Hannah and Marcel are coldly academic, because they're not. They definitely bring a lot of emotion into their podcast, and I think they start tearing up in certain episodes, which I love because it just warms my heart. I feel like looking at books through a religious or a spiritual way, not necessarily religious, which is what they do. They, even though that they are respectively Jewish and Christian, I think is what it is, and they leave it as an open, they see, instead of religious, it's more sacred. And I think that's something a lot of people can relate with. And when you turn a book into something sacred, it just adds so much more weight to the book and to the things that you're discussing. It's just beautiful. There are episodes where I'm just sitting there tearing up and being like, oh, they're real people. The characters, I mean, not Vanessa and Casper. So, oh yeah, the difference with this is that while Witch Please talks about the books, they discuss the themes within each book. The episodes in Harry Potter and the Sacred Text are structured in a way that they go book by book, chapter by chapter. So they examine every single chapter, a theme in every single chapter, or multiple themes, the characters, they really go one by one. And it all culminates into what I think is people's favorite part of the podcast, which is the spiritual practice at the end. So they use spiritual practices of reading a sacred text to analyze a little bit deeper. They give a blessing to a character, and then they say that, I can't think of a specific example. Well, I can, but I just don't remember what it's called. So there are ways in spiritual practices to read lines for this reason, we'll say the Quran. There are specific ways to read certain passages, certain lines, and then meditation kind of methods that go along with it. And that's what they do. And they do a different one each episode. And since they want to, they never try to take other people's religious practices and apply it to themselves. So sometimes what they do is they bring in people with other, with religions that are not Christian and Jewish to explain how they would do a sacred practice with this book. And it's beautiful. I think it's just so gorgeous. I feel so light and weightless after I listen to that podcast. So I think it's amazing to just listen to Witch Please and then Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, one back to back, because even though they touch on the same things, they go about it in a different way. And you always get something valuable out of both of them. So that's my rant for these two. I love these. These are, when I was driving back from school every night, this is what I would listen to on my commute. And it's amazing. It's so good. So, third podcast is Hot and Bothered. And Hot and Bothered is a podcast made by Vanessa Sultan of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And it is about the journey of writing a romance novel. So she starts it off by discussing the importance of romance novels in people's lives, and then goes on to challenge her friends to write their own romance novels. And so the podcast is her talking to her friends through every step of the process and understanding the tropes that they use, why they use them, what it reflects about themselves. And I think something that I really like is that Vanessa isn't afraid to challenge her own preconceived notions of romance, both in literature and in real life. And I think that's overall a good human trait to have. So it's beautiful to see that reflected. I think it shows a lot of humanity in a podcast. It's an awesome podcast. Definitely listen to it. Then podcast number 4 is Books and Boba, which is a podcast hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yue, dedicated to showcasing Asian and Asian American authors and books. So they cover a lot of genres that are written by and about these about these people, and they're always on the lookout for new releases. I always on the podcast wanting to immediately read every book that they discuss, and I love that they're so laid back yet passionate about the topics and the books that they're discussing. And when they're interviewing people, it's the same thing, and it just feels like you're in the room having a conversation with them, or listening to the conversation in this case. Own voices are so important, and the fact that, there are times when they also discuss their lives, so they bring in a little bit of culture, specific cultural events from their cultures, which is, I think, a beautiful thing. So you will always learn, especially if you're not Asian or Asian American. As a Latinx woman, it's awesome to be able to learn about people and different cultures in this way. Support own voices, right? And then we move on to podcast number 5, which is Annotated. Annotated is a podcast within Book Riot, and I'm reading this exactly from their website. They discuss the different aspects of books, reading, and language. In the most recent episode, they discussed The Babysitter's Club, which is a series that if you haven't read it, you at least know about it. Like me, never read it, but I always saw it. And they did interviews with people who either worked on the books or worked on the movies or just have been impacted by the series in any way. And I love that kind of dynamic where the hosts give you the facts about things, which is what they did. They really give you a timeline. They give you the supporting facts about it. And then they let the people that have been affected by these books give you their own accounts of it. I think that's a beautiful way to discuss a book, especially if it really impacted you. And they're very diverse about it too. So, excuse me. So I think it just adds a different layer to discussing a book, and that's beautiful. And then my honorable mention podcast is one that a lot of people might know. It's What You Missed in History Class. Now, I know it's not technically a book podcast, but my train of thought is, how do you learn about history and how do you do research without reading, right? So it counts. It meets the criteria. I'm here for it. I'm sticking to that, right? So it's a podcast hosted by 2 historians who go in depth about people and events in history that are not so well known, and sometimes they do well-known events in history. And they just find the most obscure texts, or they just dive so deep into the research of it all. And it's so fun to just sit there and nerd out with them about everything. So I love this podcast. I'm pretty sure that I've been listening to it like every single day. If there's a podcast I listen to every single day, it's this one, because I try to like go back in the archives and start my way from number 1 to where they are now. And sometimes I re-listen to certain episodes because I love them so much. And some of my favorite episodes have been about fashion. So I just love that. Like, they cover history in all of its aspects. I think sometimes we're under the notion, or people try to convince us, that history is just war or important people. And as you know that conversation that people have been having for a while now, that the history that we learn is the history that is dictated for us to learn, for lack of better words, in terms of, you know, what we learn in history books are just, I think it's really subpar, you know? It's important in a certain way, but in another, it's just, what's the narrative? Old white men who were probably slave owners and, oh, do you hear the rain? And did something. But even that isn't enough. Like, they just don't give you enough information, and it's delivered in such a dry way. And history is not just politics and war. Although you could argue that everything that humans do in their lives is political, which I do argue that. I argue that even if you're doing something for yourself, it still makes a political statement. Fashion is a political statement. And so for them to discuss that, for example, it's amazing. So it makes my geeky little heart just so happy to sit there and listen to them talk about history, especially history that's not well known, and world history. They don't just focus on American history, it's world history. It's amazing. I love going into a podcast and leaving it knowing more than I did when I went in, you know? So those are my 5-ish book podcasts. I'll leave the links to them down below, but these are the podcasts that really make my heart so happy. And like I said, maybe in a different video, I'll do more podcast talks about other things that interest me, because I have a lot. Thank goodness my phone has a lot of memory, because otherwise, yeah, I don't know. I don't know where I would save all of it. So, yeah, let me know if you like them, if you've listened to any of these, and also let me know which ones you would recommend that I listen to. My interests are very wide and varied, so you can put anything down here and I will definitely listen to it. Okay, bye!